Hi, I'm Jen. Welcome back to the North Garden for today's edition of Como Live, brought to you by the Legacy Amendment. So today in the North Garden, we're going to focus on wicked plant themes. So we're going to look at some of the not so nice aspects of some of the plants that I get to take care of in the North Garden here. And I just want to mention that this idea came to us partly through an exhibit that was done at the Bell Museum on wicked plants, and it's based on a book called Wicked Plants by Amy Stewart. So if you're particularly interested, you can look up that book by Amy Stewart. So we've got three categories of wicked plants to touch on today, and the first one I'm going to talk about is plants that poke or stick you. All right, so we have one of the most impressive examples of that is the acacia tree. And the acacia tree here that we're growing in the North Garden is native to Africa, and it has some very impressive thorns on it. So when we start to talk about wicked plants, the thing I really want to focus on is why plants have these adaptations that we might consider sort of scary or creepy or less than nice. So the thing about plants that stick and poke, plants that have thorns and vines, is that they develop that adaptation to protect from herbivory. So that's just a fancy way of saying they don't want to get eaten, right? So thorns are going to be a plant defense against being eaten by animals for the most part. That's the most common reason a plant develops that adaptation. And I do have a close-up if you want to really see how long these spines are. I trimmed the acacia tree in here not too long ago, so I took the leaves off this branch so you can see those thorns more close up. And when you get a look at them close up like that, you can also see that they're really light in color. And I think it's interesting to note that the thorns have actually more than one purpose. So it's not just that they will protect the plant from being eaten, but that light color is actually really good at reflecting off the sunlight in the really hot climate where this plant lives. And so that those thorns have that dual purpose of helping to keep the plant cool enough. So I think that that's interesting. And if you think about anything that a plant produces, it takes energy for that plant to grow something like a thorn, right? So it would make sense that it would have more than one reason for putting all that energy into those thorns. So I thought that was a really interesting thing I learned about the acacia thorns. And I think another interesting thing to point out, especially because we have giraffes here at Como Zoo, is that even though this plant is trying super hard to protect itself from being eaten, giraffes have their own adaptation where they have these amazing tongues that can actually take the leaves off these trees and not get poked by those thorns. So that's kind of hard to imagine how they do it. I can tell you that I cannot prune this tree without getting stuck, so their tongues are more dexterous than my fingers are. So I have another little example of a cactus plant, another example of a plant that has something that sticks or pokes. Cactus are something that come to mind when you think of things that have thorns, right? And this particular tiny cactus is one that's native to Minnesota, which is kind of amazing. And you probably learned quite a bit about it from watching other editions of Como Live. But I brought it out again because I wanted to talk about the way, again, that these prickers have a dual purpose. So with this cactus, again, and partly it is a defense mechanism so that it doesn't get eaten by critters. But also, if you've ever looked at a cactus that you thought might be fuzzy and then made the mistake of touching it, you might have gotten some of those barbs that actually stuck in your skin and were pretty painful. And the same is true of the stickers on this cactus. They actually kind of grab on and are hard to get off. And that is actually a way that the cactus is able to break off little pieces of itself, or pieces will break off if an animal bumps into it, and then the barbs kind of stick in the animal, and it carries it off to a new place. So it's a way that the cactus is able to sort of grow, spread itself and grow, in a new area. So that, again, is a dual purpose for those thorns. And one last very impressive thorny plant here in the North Garden is the silk floss tree. The silk floss tree has very sharp thorns on it. And even though I'm touching these, I'm touching them very, very lightly. They are so thick and wide that they almost look like they would be dull. But I can tell you from working around this tree trunk that if you forget they're there and put your hand out, they're no joke. One thing that's interesting about the silk floss tree is that it puts all its energy into these thorns low down on the trunk, and then higher up they get sparser, and on the very top branches there's no thorns at all. So you can kind of get some idea that it's being protected from animals that are on the ground and doesn't need to put the energy into that protection on those upper branches, and so it doesn't. So another interesting way the plant has adapted the thorns to protect itself as needed. All right, so now that we've talked about thorns, we're going to move on to sap or plant juices that hurt. So there are quite a few of these plants in the North Garden, unfortunately. So as a gardener, I have learned to protect myself from that. And a lot of home gardeners might have learned about this sort of thing the hard way, because my first two examples here on the cart, these are both super common houseplants. So you kind of don't think of them as being dangerous in any way. They seem innocent enough. So this one, the Pothos Vine, and this one is called Dieffenbachia. So the common name of Dieffenbachia is dumb cane. And that's actually a reference to sort of an old-fashioned term, the use of dumb as in meaning mute or unable to speak. So if you made the mistake of chewing on this plant, you would actually have such bad swelling on your vocal cords and throat and tongue that you wouldn't be able to speak. And so that's how it gets that common name. So hopefully you haven't made that mistake, but even just working with the plant, if you cut it, or if you cut the Pothos Vine, they both have the same material in them that causes a really bad irritation. And it's called calcium oxalate crystals. And what's interesting about those crystals is they're actually like sort of very sharply shaped. They actually really like dig into your flesh. So it's not, in terms of like, if you get that irritation on your skin, it's not as easy to get off as you might think. You can't just wash it off because those crystals have really embedded in your skin. What I do here at Como, if I make the mistake of not wearing my long sleeves, if I'm going to be trimming that vine, I use like a Brillo pad to scrub my skin in order to get those crystals out so that the irritation stops. The same material protects a lot of plants. A lot of plants produce those calcium oxalate crystals. So we hear about, with vanilla plantation workers, we hear about a skin irritation that's very common there. And we grow vanilla here in the North Garden, so you can check that out next time you get to visit. But know that if you have to work around that vine and the vine breaks and that sap gets on your skin, the same kind of irritation as with these other examples. And I do have another common plant to show you that a lot of people like to grow, like maybe outside on a patio in the summertime. These awesome tropical big-leaved elephant ears, Alocasia, have a high concentration of that calcium oxalate crystal as well. So be careful if you have to trim off one of those leaves if you're working around that plant. Be careful of getting that sap on your skin too. Again, it is a plant adaptation to prevent from being eaten. So it's an important way that the plant can protect itself. All right, so I want to move on to talking about a couple of interesting chemicals that plants produce that have different effects. So the plant I want to talk about next is our coffee plant. So most of us have very positive associations with coffee, right? Caffeine is something that a lot of people enjoy. It, gives you a boost, helps you wake up, maybe even helps your brain think a little bit better, more clearly. The interesting thing, I think, is that caffeine can have negative effects as well. And so if you think about why would a plant be producing caffeine, the answer is, again, to protect itself from insects. So the caffeine is actually a really good insect repellent, and it actually exists in the leaves in like such a high dose that it's toxic to insects that would try and feed on those leaves. Another really interesting thing, though, about the caffeine in coffee is that all parts of the plant produce the caffeine. So humans figured out that we could extract the caffeine from the seeds, which we call the coffee beans. There's also caffeine in the nectar of the flowers. So this plant has adapted to where the caffeine concentration in the leaves is so high that it's toxic to insects, but the caffeine concentration in the nectar is just enough to give insects a good buzz, just maybe similar to like having a cup of coffee. And so an insect that feeds on that nectar, the plant puts energy into producing that nectar because it wants to attract insects to be pollinated. And the caffeine is an extra added incentive and actually has been found to help those insects sort of remember the scent of that flower and want to return to it. So sort of just another amazing example of an adaptation and why these plants are producing these chemicals. Almost makes you start to think that wicked is really the wrong word for it. It's really just thinking about it. Maybe if you could imagine you were a plant, it just makes a lot of sense that it would want to produce these chemicals for all these different reasons. All right, and we have one final example. And this one is called the Curari vine. And I remember in an undergraduate anthropology class learning about a tribe in the Amazon that uses poison-tipped arrows. So it turns out that curari is a plant that's used to make the poison to dip arrows in for hunting. Now, you might wonder why we would have a poisonous plant like that here. Well, I mean, it is important maybe to point out that lots of plants, again, I think we kind of touched on this today, do create or have different kinds of chemicals, and some of them could be toxins. So let's remember to not touch or put anything from this room in your mouth or from the conservatory in general. But it's not actually going to be poisonous to simply touch a leaf of this plant. The toxin or the poison is produced by taking large amounts of the plant material, including the bark and the roots, and boiling it down. So it's boiled down into what makes this really sticky substance, and then arrows would be dipped in that. And it's then used in hunting to paralyze the prey. So animal hit with a poison-tipped arrow that's dipped in curari would be paralyzed. Another, and this is maybe the most wicked story I have about a plant from this room. The thing that I learned about curari is that as people, medical doctors in the 19th century were kind of exploring what could be done with this poison that they'd seen used in hunting, and they tried it out as an anesthesia in surgery. It wasn't used very often, but a couple of times apparently someone was doing some research on how it was working as an anesthesia. Unfortunately, this compound only paralyzes. It does not anesthetize or reduce pain. And so what they found after doing the surgery, unfortunately, was that those patients could feel everything during the surgery. They were merely paralyzed, so they couldn't react. So modern anesthesiologists have a lot better options. But it is interesting to note that there are some options that are used in anesthesiology that do have paralyzing effects. So paralyzation can be a part of anesthesia. It's just that it would be combined with something that would kill pain as well, and make sure that the patient also wasn't aware of what was happening necessarily. So that is the conclusion of our little segment on wicked plants of the North Garden. And I hope that you learned something new, and I hope that you join us again. I did want to see if we had any questions that came through, but we didn't, so we're good. But if you do have questions, if this brought up anything, feel free to shoot us a comment and we will get back to you. Thank you.